Hello, my friends. Mrs. Surratt here to talk to you guys about Standard 9, which refers to the Civil War and talks about the causes, course, and consequences of the Civil War. That's a bit of a tongue twister. So we're going to be thinking about some important events today, some issues, and basically what caused the Civil War, what happened during it, and then what was kind of the end result. So we're going to dive right in here. Oh, by the way, there's some key questions here, and if you want to take a moment to jot these down, and then you can go through them and write yourself some notes. I'll wait. It's no problem. No, I'm just kidding. Let's get started. All right, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was a very important act that kind of leads towards the Civil War. If you remember, when we got some new land with the Louisiana Purchase, we created the Missouri Compromise, and it basically said at 3630 there's a line. Anything north of it will not have slavery, and anything south of it will have slavery. Well, when Kansas and Nebraska were trying to become states, they were trying to get organized, they were both north of this line. And the problem is, if they both came in as free states, then the North was going to have more representatives in Congress than the South. So Kansas-Nebraska Act was proposed by Stephen Douglas, and the idea was, instead of the federal government saying where slavery could and couldn't be, let's give popular sovereignty. Let's let the people vote to make their own decisions. That's what popular sovereignty is. And what happens with this act is that people who are pro-slavery flood into Kansas and Nebraska, and people who are against slavery flood in, and they not only get into verbal battles, they start beating each other up and shooting each other. You have bleeding Kansas. It's a big mess. But they have to decide, would they be free or would they be slave states? Now, another thing to think about before the beginning of the Civil War is the Dred Scott versus Sanford case. This is a court case in which a slave was taken by his master into the northern states. They lived there for a period of time, and then they came back to the South. And when the owner died, the slave sued the widow, that Dred Scott, and he said, hey, you guys took me to a northern state. I'm not a slave anymore. You have to give me and my family our freedom. Well, they go to court, and the Supreme Court hears this case and says, not only are you not free, but you're not even a citizen. You can't sue the widow. And what's more, you're not even a person, you're property. And basically, Dred Scott says that slaves are now property. Well, the thing is, you can't deny someone their property. Think about the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is a fancy way of saying having the right to property. You can't take away these rights from people. So what that means is now slave owners can go anywhere and own slaves because popular sovereignty is done. The people can't decide if they want slaves or not. The Supreme Court has said that slaves are property, so you can't rule against property. And this becomes a big, big issue towards the war. You also have John Brown, who was a radical abolitionist, and here's a picture of him painted as larger than life. He wasn't really like super tall or anything. But he was not only against slavery, he led violent uprisings against slave owners in Kansas and Virginia. And he actually took a group of slaves to Harper's Ferry in Virginia to raid their weapons supply and was caught and later hanged. But this really made the South angry. All right, so some causes of the Civil War. You have the difference in economy. The North, of course, is a manufacturing economy who wants higher tariffs, and the South is the agricultural economy who wants lower tariffs. A tariff, if you remember, is a tax on imported goods. Well, the North doesn't want manufactured goods to be imported from somewhere else and be sold instead of their goods, so they put a tax on it to make that more expensive. The South, on the other hand, they're trading their cotton, let's say, with Great Britain, and then Great Britain is manufacturing dresses. Well, if Great Britain's dresses have a tariff on them and they're more expensive, Great Britain can't sell many dresses, so they're not going to trade with the South. So the South wants lower tariffs. So this whole idea of the types of economy and tariffs, very important causes. You also have the type of labor. North wants wage earners. They want people who work for money. Sorry. The South wants slave labor. They want people who are owned and work for free, basically. And this leads to the second part, which is North has a very large growing abolition movement. The idea that slavery is evil and immoral, and therefore you should not have slavery, versus the South, who wants to hold on to their way of life. They don't want to be told how to make this change. And so the Dred Scott decision of property, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry plays into this movement. The Underground Railroad, where people like Harriet Tubman are sneaking slaves up to the North to become free, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which paints a horrible picture of slave life. This all pushes people towards abolition. Whereas in the South, they're really afraid of losing their way of life. And once Abraham Lincoln is elected president, they pretty much figured that's it. You know what? We got to become our own country if we want to keep this. So they secede. And they attack Fort Sumter, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But this is really kind of what leads the driving forces behind the beginning of the Civil War. Now I want you to take a look at this chart, and I want you to look at these categories, the percent of the country's population. One of the questions is, at the beginning of the war, which side was more prepared to fight? So you've got the North with 71% of the country's population, and the South, also called the Confederacy, with 29% of the country's population. And basically, as you look down this chart, you can see that the North has more railroads, more industry, they have an industrial or manufacturing economy, but this is so key right here, guys. Their army and government. They have a standing army that's been working together for years, and they have the government of the United States still working for them. So they don't have, like the South has a brand new army and a brand new government, so they've not been working together. So on paper, at the beginning, it really looked like the North was just going to crush the South, and that was going to be the end of it. Now, some leaders that you need to make sure you're aware of. Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States. His counterpart was Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, or the Southern states. The main leaders, or the main generals of the war, the Northern general was Ulysses S. Grant. And he wasn't actually the guy they chose at first, but he's kind of the guy they ended up with, and he turned out to be a really good choice. And the South, now the South actually had the most experienced leader in the entire war. They had Robert E. Lee, and he was considered like the best of the best. Lincoln said to him, please fight for the North. And he's like, dude, I want to, but I'm Southern at heart. I can't. I've got to fight for the South. So he led the Confederate forces, and on paper, he was definitely the one to beat. Excuse me, but Grant, pardon me, sorry about that, I've got some allergies. Grant was the one who had more of the military and the manufacturing on his side. Then you have some important generals. William T. Sherman for the North, he's the one who marched on Atlanta, burning it, and then marched to Savannah. And you also have Stonewall Jackson, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, who was a Confederate general known for standing fast in battle. When the Union forces came at him, they said he stood like a stone wall and refused to let his men run away. All right, I've picked a few battles here that I want to make sure you're familiar with. There are so many battles in the Civil War. Oh my gosh, you can find books and books on just one battle alone. We picked out 5 that we thought were super important, but there are tons of battles. The first one is Fort Sumter. And this was where a Union fort, once the South seceded, there was a Union fort in South Carolina that kind of controlled access to the sea. And being that they trade with overseas partners, they've got to have that access to the sea. So the South says to Lincoln, well, this is ours now. It's on our land. And Lincoln says, oh, I don't think so. And they said, you and what army, dude? So Lincoln realizes, because remember, his primary goal is to keep control of the Union. He wants to keep the Union together. He's realizing, man, if I send troops down there, it looks like I want war, and I don't. But if I don't send anything down there, then those poor guys are like hung out to dry. So he kind of sends some supplies, but he just sort of stays back and hopes for the best, and it doesn't work out. The South attacks the fort, takes it over, drives the Union out, and the Civil War begins. Now, Antietam we chose because this is the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. More men were lost there in one day than just about any other battle. The South was actually marching towards Washington, D.C., and they were going to take over the capital of the North, and the North realized this, so they kind of came down to stop them, and so the two armies met, and the North is able to stop the Confederacy, but instead of pushing on or, yay, we won, it was sort of more like everyone just quit. Everyone just gave up for a bit. Even though there's no outright win, Lincoln does claim it as a win, and this is what he uses to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which I'll talk about that in a moment. Vicksburg was a battle where the North was able to seize control of the Mississippi River. The South was using Vicksburg kind of as a hub. They were sending supplies back and forth. And remember, the West is where the majority of the foodstuffs were grown. So most of the food is coming in through the Mississippi River. Well, with Vicksburg, the North basically surrounds the city and just starves them out. And so the city gives up and they're able to take it over, and it just cuts the Confederacy in half because now you can't get those Western supplies over to the other side. Gettysburg was a desperate attack by General Lee to try and keep the war effort going for the South. He attacks the North at Gettysburg, and after 3 days of extremely intense fighting, he loses, and this gives the Northern cause a boost. And then with the Battle of Atlanta, Atlanta was the major hub of Southern manufacturing and transportation, what little there was of it. So Sherman goes down to destroy Atlanta, but really to get the guns, to get the important structures. He burns these, and then he moves on towards Savannah, burning everything in his path. So when you're thinking about the battles, it's important to think about which battles kind of changed the game for the South and which one changed the game for the North. So when we think about Abraham Lincoln, we have to ask ourselves, what is his primary goal and what is his secondary goal? And that doesn't mean that they're not both important. It just means that his primary goal is kind of the one he's had the whole time, the most important. If he had to choose between the two, he'd take this one, but they're really close to each other. The secondary goal is the one that is important, but like I said, he'd probably give it up if it meant that he could have his primary goal. His primary goal was to preserve the Union, keep the United States in one piece, bring it back together, make it a country again. And when he was president, he expanded the power of the presidency dramatically. He basically just took over and said to Congress, okay, here's what we're going to do. And he did so with the knowledge that when the war was over, he's going to give all this power back. He was just doing it to have one centralized leader. One of the things he takes away is habeas corpus. And habeas corpus says that a person cannot be put in prison without proof of their guilt and a court case. And he basically gives this up because he says, look, guys, we don't have time to go through all these court cases. If someone we think is guilty, we'll put him in jail and sort it out afterwards. He made several important speeches, including the Gettysburg Address, which was, again, to his primary goal of preserving the Union, saying the United States and democracy is going to last no matter what happens. The Emancipation Proclamation, which declares all slaves in the Confederacy free. Now remember, the North has some border states, which are slave states that are fighting with the North. They don't want to make them mad, so he only declares slaves free in the Confederacy. But this is his secondary goal, to free the slaves. That becomes not his primary goal, but his secondary goal. In the beginning of the war, when people said, let's free the slaves, he was like, let's wait and see. And your last one is the second inaugural address, which was given when he became president for the second time. And this is kind of when the war seemed closer to an end. And basically he's saying to the North and South, look, this war stunk. It's no fun. No one should be blamed. Forgive and forget, guys. Work together, rebuild the nation, preserve that union, and don't fight with each other, which of course, that's pretty hard to do when you're angry at other people. So the thing about the Civil War, it's our first modern war, if you will. We had ironclads, boats that had metal or iron on their sides, kind of moving towards the idea of submarines or like the big warboats we have today. Hot air balloons were used. They would float up to be able to look down and kind of see what was going on and make strategy. Gatling guns, repeating guns started to be showed up. There was even an early submarine. This was pretty cool, and if you're interested in that kind of thing, you should look it up. That came up at this time. The civilian population was far more involved fully than ever, and they actually get to see the reality of war through this new medium of photography. So there were people who were actually taking pictures of the war. Women are participating in this war effort. They were nurses, spies, workers. It's pretty cool. If you're interested, you should look that up. And the thing about the Civil War is it was 620,000 deaths, so many wounded. There was farmland devastated, homes, businesses burned, destroyed. But it answers these constitutional questions about, was the federal government supreme to state governments? Because remember, South Carolina wanted to secede. The federal government didn't want them to. It ends slavery. And it also has this political and economic power shift towards the north, towards industry, towards manufacturing. So I hope that this helps you in your study for the end of course test, and I'll be back. Have a great day.